Welcome to the 17th episode of Certum Group's podcast, Alternative Litigation Strategies, where I interview leaders in the legal industry from all parts of the country. On this program, we discuss not only the latest trends and developments that are currently happening in the world of class action and other types of commercial litigation, but we also discuss the latest legal strategies that in-house and outside counsel are employing to produce more efficient and better quality legal services, which is exactly what my guest today is going to discuss with us. I'm your host, Kevin Skrzysowski, with the legal consulting firm Certum Group. And today I am pleased to be joined by Jason Karp, a partner with Outside GC, a firm providing on-demand outside general counsel legal services. Jason, it's a pleasure to have you today. Welcome to the program.
Great, Kevin. Thanks so much. Really happy to be here.
Wonderful. So now, Jason, today we are going to discuss your four-part series that you authored that I initially saw featured in Lexology's newsfeed on how in-house counsel can provide more value to their organizations. But before we get to that, can we just start by having you tell us a little bit about your career and how you ended up at Outside GC and really why Outside GC was formed, because it really is a fascinating business model.
Yeah, absolutely. So hard to believe I've been doing this for over 30 years. That flew by. I have a lot less hair now than I did when I began. So that's how I know I've been doing it for so long. But yeah, I have a really interesting career. I mean, it's been really phenomenal from my perspective. So I've had the pleasure of being involved with private corporations as in-house counsel, public companies as in-house counsel and chief legal officer. I've had several stints with the federal government, including the Federal Communications Commission many moons ago, and most recently the First Responder Network Authority, which was created several years ago to deploy a nationwide broadband network for public safety as a new government agency. I've been in private practice, both traditional private practice as well as Outside GC, which I'll consider kind of the newfangled, more innovative private practice, that we'll talk a little bit about. So yeah, I've had some really interesting experiences. They've spanned a number of industries: technology, software, SaaS, ad tech, ed tech, a lot of work in telecommunications. Started my career in patents and intellectual property, and even did a little bit of insurance defense litigation at one point in my life. I don't tend to talk about that very much, though.
Well, definitely have had a very broad and storied legal career as in-house counsel. So how long has Outside GC been around, and why was it formed? What was the need, the hole in the marketplace that you and your colleagues saw?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Outside GC's been around, give or take 15 years or so. And it was really intended to fill a gap. And, I can't take any credit for this. I mean, the founders themselves were real innovators. And I think they saw this, both lawyers, that saw a gap, right? A gap in how legal services were being provided. Smaller companies could not necessarily afford to hire full-time in-house general counsel. And even larger companies had a need for additional resources, potentially, or other support, and they had very limited options, right? So if you can't afford to hire someone in-house, you have to go to outside counsel. The traditional outside counsel model, as you know, tends to be very expensive: time and materials, billing rates, maximize hours. It's not very cost effective. And on top of that, many of these outside counsel, I think historically, they also just don't understand your business to the same extent that you do, or that potentially in-house counsel would. So the founders really saw a niche to say, hey, we need to fill this gap where we can either act as an outsourced general counsel on demand for these smaller companies at a very cost-effective rate, where they can leverage the resources and ramp up and down as they need to. But in addition, we can offer services to larger organizations that just need to ramp up because they've got an influx, maybe end of quarter, end of year, a big deal, something going on that requires more resources. And they need pragmatic day-to-day lawyering opposed to big transaction or big litigation. And again, it needs to be done on a cost-effective basis. And that's really what Outside GC was founded for and about, and brings together a tremendous talent pool of former in-house counsel. I think on average, folks have been practicing at least 20 years, of kind of that partner level, senior partner level experience, but folks who've been in-house for a bulk of their career. So they understand the levers and the puts and the takes and the critical issues that impact day-to-day business operations. So it's really a nice combination of filling a niche that no one else was really addressing.
I can definitely see that. I can see how you fill that niche, and the historical timing is what really makes a lot of sense. I was working largely with AIM Law 200 defense firms. About 15 years ago, when Outside GC was formed, that was the same time when the market crashed after the housing bubble burst, and all outside counsel were struggling to keep their clients, and businesses and in-house legal departments were now forcing them to compete much more hard for the business that they were getting. And at that time, all you heard from the marketplace was you can't just know your client's legal problems, but you have to know their business, and you have to know their industry, and you have to know who their competitors are. So I can definitely see the genesis of Outside GC really getting involved in the market at the right time and providing a very valuable service to the market. What overall services do you provide? Is there a specialization? Is it completely broad-based? Do you have a certain target market? I mean, you had mentioned small businesses, but also larger ones. Is there a sweet spot for Outside GC?
It's a great question. I mean, and I hate to say that we're all things for everyone because we're not, right? I mean, but we do offer a very broad array of services. So you nailed it. We definitely love to work with those smaller startup, emerging growth companies, folks with no legal departments, small legal departments, those who have constrained budgets. We can offer tremendous value there. But we have some of the largest of the large clients as well. It's interesting because even though they may have very significant in-house legal departments with the volume of work going on, they need to expand. And oftentimes they'll have people who are out or they just have a surge in work. And so we can kind of provide that supplemental work, but do it in a way that it's not going to bust their budgets. And even large legal departments and large companies today, everybody is having to manage budgets across the board, in particular in the legal field as well. Legal departments, particularly given the general high cost of outsourced legal services. So from that perspective, we have a pretty broad gamut of who we serve. In types of services, if it's something that's handled in-house, we basically do it. So think of labor and employment, immigration, data privacy, of course, commercial transactions, technology transactions, corporate transactions. We've got a very large intellectual property group that does patent, copyright, trademark work. Think about corporate governance, and we sit on boards and we work with boards and
Sure.
we do compliance, right? And so it really is everything that you could think of that an in-house counsel would be responsible for, short of major litigation. We are not a major litigation firm, and kind of short of that big public company securities work. We tend to stay in that.
Understood. Yeah, I think the major litigation still does get farmed out to the heavy hitters of the litigation industry and the outside counsel. So it makes sense that you're full service with that exception. That's sort of the world that we operate in, working with businesses and outside counsel, helping to provide some certainty in the uncertain world of litigation through all of the litigation insurance and funding and monetization solutions. So that makes complete sense to me. But I'll tell you, your comment about budgets and cost certainty really ruling the day is what we hear from our corporate clients with every matter that we're working on, and how can they wrap their heads around some cost certainty with whatever legal matters that they're handling. So let me jump in and ask you. So what prompted you to begin writing your multi-part series that I initially saw in Lexology about adding value to in-house counsel? Are you seeing a need for a paradigm shift in the way that in-house lawyers are approaching their jobs?
So I am definitely seeing this, but I'll tell you, this all started for me, I'd say back in 1997, 98. Believe it or not. And I saw the need back then. I was obviously a very young lawyer at the time, but I was working for what was a very, very large telecommunications company, tens and tens of thousands of employees. And back in the day when we had long distance and local services and all of that kind of stuff. And I had just come from the FCC and had been involved in drafting some new regulations after the 1996 Telecom Act had passed. So this was all new regulations, new framework. I was very familiar with it. And I had the pleasure of being hired into this company in a business role, which was my first time really in a business role, not as a legal role, but they wanted to leverage my legal expertise in what was a strategic operations role. And so I oversaw both strategic operations and how to pursue some of these new markets the company wanted to get into, as well as finance and financial analysis. And so that was a great learning experience. But what it did is it put me on the client side of the table. So I wasn't the lawyer, but now I was the in-house client working with what was a very large legal department. And I was sitting in the client seat, which was kind of a different experience for me. Yeah, but it was an eye-opening experience. And I remember to this day, it was almost an epiphany. And we were doing some negotiations with carriers, and we were also doing some advocacy with the FCC. And the in-house legal department, from my perspective, just wasn't hearing what we needed. They kind of had their own agenda. They were operating kind of almost as their own independent entity, almost like their own law firm within the business. And it was very frustrating to me when we were trying to advocate certain things for the business that they weren't really addressing. And part of it was they weren't listening. Part of it was, I think, based on that they had their own assumptions about what needed to be done because of their historical work with the company. And this was a new area for them. And it became very frustrating to me. And I remember having this conversation with myself saying, that's not the lawyer I'm going to be. I don't want to be that lawyer. That's not the way legal services should be provided. That is not helpful. I understand now a little bit better why there are some of these stereotypes about lawyers being roadblocks or impeding the ability to get business done. And so that was really the genesis of it. It took me a little bit of time. And like I said, a little less hair and a little more gray hair of what's left to really come to a level of experience where I was ready to kind of put these thoughts down on paper and share them. And I just think there's a huge need. I mean, and we could talk a little bit more about this, but there's been some shift in the legal arena in this regard. But compared to the rest of the world, the rest of the business world, the legal market has moved very, very slowly in its migration and
it has
evolution, right? And so, yes, I absolutely, it just was the right time to share these ideas and really start pushing them. And I hate to say this, but I even had a very recent experience where it felt like it was 30 years ago, and it was just a slog through a contract where an outside firm was just litigating every single item. And it was not pragmatic, and it was not productive, and it led to bad feelings, and it led to acrimony, and it was a very difficult negotiation. So absolutely a need.
Yeah. And I think that is a fresh, innovative perspective that you had years before the rest of the market began to preach about this paradigm shift. But I mean, I've been hearing for years, as I mentioned, from the outside counsel's perspective, you can't just know their legal work, but you have to understand their business, their clients, their competition. And we've been hearing that again since the Great Recession 15 plus years ago. However, when we're sometimes working with businesses, they'll tell us that there are specific financial and business reasons and objectives that they need to accomplish that either encourage them to perhaps settle a case or pursue litigation or push it and continue to litigate. But oftentimes the outside lawyer isn't focused on that. And it's just this binary equation of like fight, or settle, and why. And there's a disconnect. But also, when we're working with businesses and I'm working with general counsel, or we do a lot of work with heads of litigation, we're often told that the in-house lawyers are being driven to provide more value across the enterprise of the organization and to make sure that the in-house department is in line with the CFO's office specifically. Now, I do want to dive into the articles, which is the purpose of the show today, but I do want to ask you, and I'm asking this a bit for a self-serving purpose, but are you seeing a push to turn the legal department from a cost center to a profit center? And again, I'm asking for self-serving purposes because one of our offerings is working with businesses to help them identify and monetize latent litigation assets, meaning claims, lawsuits that they may have against a vendor or a contractor or a class action they're involved in that they can opt out of and pursue individually, but they choose not to because they don't have the means. And so companies like mine and other litigation funders will provide basically a cash infusion as a boon to their balance sheet in exchange for an assignment of part or all of the rights to their claims to basically do just that, help them turn from a cost to a profit center. Are you seeing that much across the board with the corp companies that you are working with?
It's a great question. And I'm going to say yes, with an asterisk, right? Because I don't think there's quite the push to say that legal has to be a profit center per se. We're not there yet, but there is definitely a movement in that direction where legal departments have to be seen as adding business value. it's not just about risk mitigation, right? It has to be about promoting the business, about moving the business forward. And in some cases, that is about monetization, right? I mean, there are things where I see in leveraging an IP strategy that may not have been thought of where you can actually monetize it. Or as in your case, right, in litigation management, real estate is another area where we have seen ways that you can whether you're either creating revenue through leasing or subleasing, or on the other side, mitigating cost, right? So that's the other thing. It's not necessarily just profit, but then how can you reduce the company's costs from a legal perspective and helping to manage and support some of the different initiatives within the company. So we're definitely seeing that. I think it's important also just from a deal perspective, right? The day-to-day stuff, right? There needs to be more value in facilitating business transactions, right? And you can't be seen as that roadblock anymore, because what happens if you're a roadblock? People are going to try to go around you, right? If you're a roadblock, you're slowing things down. If you're a roadblock, you're going to create distrust. And so it's really about facilitation. So even I'm seeing things like legal KPIs where you're looking at, I mean, we have a KPI that I put in place before on just responsiveness, right? We need to respond to our clients within a certain period of time. A KPI in terms of volume of deals done, but with a caveat. It's not just about getting the deals done. They have to be good deals. So that has to be read in conjunction with another KPI about the quality of the contracts and the deals that you're doing. But you're starting to see measurement tools, right, within legal departments that you never saw before. Key performance indicators, OKRs, you've seen this in businesses, in departments throughout businesses for many, many, many years. But legal's often kind of been off on its own and kind of managed itself on its own. Now it's being brought into that fold and really measuring productivity. The other thing that we've seen, and I think this is really fascinating, and I love this piece of it, and where we've seen a lot of progress, is in legal operations. That's something that it has, I think, moved forward significantly in terms of how the business of law within companies is being run. So from deal inception to close to contract management, right? We're seeing contract lifecycle management programs. We're seeing legal fee and invoice technologies in terms of managing invoices. We're seeing the application of AI on contracts, on invoices, and integrated and automated workflows with the rest of the business. So think a contract lifecycle management system being integrated with a Salesforce.com CRM. So your sales folks can go right into Salesforce like they normally do and have access to contracts and be able to do a lot of the things that legal had to do previously, but now they can do them on their own and create more efficiency, and then track that throughout its life cycle, right? As it's negotiated, be automatically sent to folks that need to approve and review and provide red lines, and then ultimately have a repository, right, where things can be reviewed and tracked, and we can track key dates and key terms and ensure that the business is not running afoul of contract terms. So in fact, in many companies and even law firms, we're seeing staffing that is focused only on legal operations. So to me, I think that's really exciting. So we are definitely moving in the direction of profit center. I don't think we're completely there yet, but we're certainly seeing that trend.
Yep, very interesting. It confirms what we're seeing as well. And we like to believe that we're in the cusp of that movement. So what we're seeing in the marketplace is completely aligned. And it is very fascinating how we're also seeing the business units overlay their metrics and their KPIs over legal matters and legal deals as well. Definitely been hearing a lot more of that just in the very last few years even. So let's talk about adding business value and dive into your articles here. So in the first installment of your series, you mentioned the first and foremost principle that both in-house counsel and outside counsel must follow in order to prove that they are a go-to trusted business advisor. Tell us what that is and take us through those components.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, if this is the only thing someone were to do, the value jumps tremendously. And that is know your client and know their business.
Absolutely.
And that's just key. And I know it sounds very basic, but you'd be surprised how many lawyers have come across over the years who they have an understanding of the business they're in, but they really don't understand the intricacies and the goals and the motivations and the incentives and the operations of the business. And those are key. Those are key items to understand if you're going to provide legal advice and help propel the business forward. So I like to use a car analogy, right? So all of us know that a car takes you from point A to point B, but is that enough to be able to have control of that car, to maximize the use of that car, to maximize fuel efficiency? No, you have to understand, one, how to operate it. You need to know the gas. You need to know the brakes. Is it an automatic? Is it a standard? Or you have to learn, the clutch. Is it an electric vehicle, right? Is it gas? Is it hybrid, right? What other features does it have in terms of GPS, right? Is it an all-terrain vehicle? Is it meant for highway, right? So you can get into the intricacies that then now you become a master over that vehicle. And now you can optimize how that vehicle operates. And so that's really the concept we're talking about in terms of knowing your client's business. First and foremost, you have to know what the product or service it is your company's offering. And I'm in the tech industry, so I'm very focused on SaaS. But there's so many different flavors of, or I'll say, as a service. There's software as a service, infrastructure, right, platform as a service, right? There's business process as a service. And then each of those has their own intricacies, right? And understanding, are they offered on a standalone basis? Do they include third-party platforms? Do they integrate with other third-party platforms? Is there particular IP that's been developed and that needs to be protected? Is it offered uniformly across the customer base, or does it require configuration on a per customer basis, right? And do you need professional services, right? You can see how you can dive into any number of these things and go deeper and deeper and deeper. And the deeper you get and the better understanding you get, the more value you're going to be able to bring. So that's one element to it. The other, and you mentioned this earlier, right, is it's really about also understanding the market, understanding the competitors, understanding the pricing model.
Yep,
right? You
absolutely.
have to work with finance teams. You have to know, right, what's my metric, right? Is it licensing revenue? Am I a manufacturer? Is it one-time fees? Is it annual recurring revenue? How is it recognized? What's my target market? Am I a B2C company? Am I going direct to consumer? Am I B2B? Am I B2B2C? Right? All of these have impact how you use data, right? I mean, data privacy, one of the biggest issues in the world right now. Well, if I'm a B2C business, boy, I really better understand that, right? Particularly with a lot of the new laws that have passed and come into effect this year. So understanding that go to market and the pricing and the cost models, and really understanding how the product is delivered to the market, what the incentives are, is critical. And another piece in terms of this philosophy is you got to know the people, right? You have to understand the organizational structure. How's the company set up? What are the different groups and who are running these groups? Who are these stakeholders? You have to know your stakeholders. Get to know them as people, get to know what they do. They have so much knowledge, and just having regular meetings, both at the executive level, but literally with individual groups, whether it's product management or engineering or professional services or client success, and certainly finance, right? You should meet with these folks regularly, understand their motivations, understand what's driving them, understand what are the key issues that they need to solve. That's going to be extremely helpful in terms of understanding how the business operates and where you as an attorney need to focus. And then finally, you got to understand operations, right? The how of all this. How does it all work? Right? How are they negotiating contracts today? How are they delivering product today? How are they doing coding? How are they offering professional services? How about client success? Does client success double as account management, right? How is this all being done? What are the operations? How do we get from raw material to finished product into the customer's hands? And then what are the controls involved to ensure that gets done efficiently and at minimal risk? But it's not just about minimal risk. In fact, I would say initially it's about how do you get it to market cost effectively. That's what the business cares about. Then you as the lawyer overlay, okay, let's do this in a smart way so that we're not putting the company at risk.
I think that's incredibly well said. And to go back to the beginning, you said principle number one, and if you learn anything from today's program, learn this, it's know your client's business. And it seems so obvious. However, your message really resonates with me at different times during my career. I've had business development roles for corporations and law firms. We would always say it's people, product, process. And you ask who, what, why, where, and how, and you dive through all of those different verticals and functions of the business. And the devil is really in the details. And until you understand the nuances and the intricacies, you really don't know it as well as you should. So spot on with that. Now, the second principle you mentioned in the second installment of your series was to understand the real questions being asked, and it focused on listening skills and how to be better at that, which I always find interesting because I feel like Listening is probably, we all know it's more than half the equation, but as lawyers, we tend to want to jump to a resolution and begin speaking and begin problem solving. So take us through understanding the real questions being asked and how to become, as a lawyer, a more effective listener.
Oh, absolutely, Kevin. The best advice, some of the best advice I ever got in my career was just simply talk less, listen more, period. And there are books written about this, as we all know, right? And listening is a skill. It's an art. It's a science. It's all the above. And it's actually really difficult to be a good, active listener, but critical for lawyers to listen. You said it. We want to jump in. We're problem solvers. That's what we do. That's what lawyers do, right? We want to jump in, and we've done this, especially experienced lawyers, right? We've done this before. Oh, we know this. We've heard this. Before you've even stopped asking your question, I'm jumping in and trying to answer it. We've got to stop that practice.
Right.
And really listen to what the client is asking. Really listen to what their concerns are and what they're saying. And then we have to look behind those words, because they have multiple implications oftentimes, and they have their own context and bias. So it's not just about listening, but then you have to kind of understand what's the context of the question. Why is it being asked? What am I trying to accomplish as a client in asking this question, right? And as I said, there's biases on both sides, right? So from the client perspective, it may be someone in marketing. So they've got a marketing hat on and they're just thinking marketing. And so you got to understand that they've got that framework they're coming from. And that then should lead to asking very probing questions about the who, what, why, when, where, right?
Exactly.
So you get the context, the full context. The other piece of this as lawyers, we've got to stop making assumptions. We have our own biases. We've seen a lot of things in our careers. Many of us have.
Prior matters and prior clients and prior experiences. And you want to draw on that quickly, right?
100%. And your own biases, and it may be your own personal biases that you've got a full plate and you're really busy, but we've got to stop and we've got to listen and we've got to be objective and open ourselves up to really hearing what's going on, really understanding it, and stop trying to apply what we think we know so that we can really answer the question that's being asked. And then ultimately, it's about keeping it simple.
Right.
Even in my life today, I have people in my family, in other words, who are like, you're being a lawyer, Dad. You're being a lawyer. Stop being a lawyer, right? It becomes part of who we are, how we talk, how we communicate. And we often forget that folks don't come from that world that we're dealing with.
Right.
They come from very different perspectives. So we got to keep it simple. We just have to explain things like the car analogy, right? That's a great way to kind of often convey information, is use an analogy, talk simply. And I don't mean these aren't smart people. They're super smart. They just come at it from a different perspective. And we're so tied into our language and our process. We need to sit back and remember where the folks we're talking to, where they're coming from.
Yeah, I think that it's fantastic advice. It's a great way to you have to rethink the way you practice and the way you do things. And sometimes you almost have to unlearn what you've learned so that you can think more innovatively and creatively going forward. So I think that's fantastic advice. Now for your third article, your third principle, and I think I found this one to be very interesting. You say in-house lawyers need to stop saying no. So I would really like to discuss what you mean by this. And I'm a little bit surprised because many people's perception of the legal department is that they're always the people who are going to tell you what you can't do. In fact, you had mentioned legal operations professionals earlier in the show. I went to a huge conference with legal ops people a year ago. You mentioned they handle a lot of vendor contracts, but while speaking with them and having lunch, so many of them said to me, we're trying to get these contracts through. We invest in a lot of tech. We do everything we can to get these executed and get this tech implemented without having to go to legal, because we don't want all like the language redlined and these basic T's and C's. We just don't want a roadblock. We want to avoid legal. So what do you mean by stop saying no? How does an in-house lawyer do that?
You hit it. You hit it so on the head. And I hear that all the time as well, especially when I work with procurement departments in larger organizations. Exactly. They try to avoid legal. Gosh, I'm like, no. Here I'm going to say no. I want you to bring it to legal. I want you to bring it to me because I want to help facilitate. And if I have something to offer, then I want to make it happen. And so I truly believe the lawyer has to take no out of the vocabulary. And I mean that in the truest sense of the word. Like there's no circumstance you should ever say no. None whatsoever. And because it's not about saying no, it's not about what you can't do. It's about what's the solution. Now, the solution may not be what the client initially expected or necessarily even wanted, but there's always a solution. It's not just about saying no. And I'll give you, an example. And again, talking simple. My son, when he was younger, inevitably an hour or less before dinner, he would come to me and say, "Dad, can I have a cookie?" And he's hungry. "Dad, can I have a cookie?" And if I were just to say no over and over and over, what happens? Well, okay, I'm saying no because I want him to have a good, healthy meal before he's eating sweets. So I think I've achieved my objective. But have I solved my son's problem?
Well, no.
No, I haven't solved this problem. And in fact, he's probably walked away dejected, feeling bad, hungry,
Angry with you. You haven't worked out a mutual solution.
And if I keep doing this day after day, what's he going to do eventually?
Stop coming to you.
Stop coming to me. And he may even go around me and try to get a cookie on his own.
Well,
And now,
it would be worse.
I haven't even solved the original problem. And that's exactly what happens in businesses with legal departments. When you say no, the first thing you do is you create an immediate barrier to the relationship, right? It hinders the ability to create trust. It closes folks off, right? And it provides the perception that you don't have an understanding of my problem. You're inflexible. You're unhelpful, right? And you're unwilling to explore creative options. No should be gone from your vocabulary. So how can I handle a cookie situation? Well, very simply. So my son comes to me and says, "Dad, can I have a cookie?" And I say, "Oh my gosh, I love cookies. You know what? We're having dinner in about 30 minutes. And of course, I want to make sure that you have great food so that you're healthy and strong. But I'll tell you what, right after dinner, let's absolutely get you that cookie. And in fact, I'll join you. We'll have a cookie together." What did I just do?
Sure. So
did I change the outcome? Right. The outcome was I didn't want him to have a cookie before dinner. I achieved that. But now we achieve so much more, right?
it's a great analogy, and it really speaks to not being the, as you mentioned in your article, the no focus lawyer who's inflexible and unhelpful and unwilling to explore creative solutions. But also going back to what we said at the very beginning of the program, you really need to be a business partner with your organization. And even the way you phrase your articles and the voice you use, referencing to your client, it's as if you're an in-house lawyer. And I know with Outside GC, you're working for your client. But even if you're an in-house lawyer who is an employee of the organization, looking at the business as your client, like I'm here to serve the business. The business really is my client. And you need to be a partner with all of the business units. And there needs to be a trifecta of objectives that everyone is working towards. And that is the legal objective, the financial objective, and the business objective.
No, that's 100% right. I mean, and to kind of move it into a more business example, let's say, in this case, rather than the cookie, because I don't have a lot of clients coming to me asking for cookies. But I've had situations where marketing or folks have come to us, for example, and said, hey, we want to use a customer name and logo for some marketing purpose. And does the contract allow it? And I could look at the contract, and I'll look at the contract, and it's silent, right? It does not give us a license or a right to use the name. And so my answer could be, I'm sorry, no, we can't do that. Well, that's scenario one with the cookie example, right? I haven't solved the problem. I haven't violated the contract, which is, as a legal person, I don't want to violate the contract. So I've solved that kind of. But, right, I haven't solved the client's issue. And if that continues to be the case, maybe they're going to do it anyway, or maybe they're going to, try to do something else that could put us at risk. And so, again, a more thought out response is actually applying principle number 2, right? Which was listening and understanding the real question being asked. So
right.
What I want to do is say, well, why do we want to use the client logo? What's your intent? What are you trying to accomplish here? Right? What kind of relationship do we have with that client? I've looked at the contract. It doesn't give us a license, but here's what we can do, right? We can reach out to the client. We've got a great relationship with them. We can ask for the consent. We can explain to them what we're doing and why we're going to do it. I'm more than happy to help and facilitate that if you'd like. Okay, we have a solution. Maybe it's not the perfect solution where they can just go off and do it. There's extra steps involved.
Right.
But we're starting to think creatively, right? And maybe that leads to, the client says, we're happy for you to use your logo. In fact, I didn't realize that you're promoting this, or this. We can be a case study for you, or we're happy to be a reference for you. Well, now we've taken it even farther. Now we've created value on top of answering the question. So these are the kinds of ways I think to think about that. And that's the kind of don't say no principle. You really don't ever have to say no. There's always a solution of some sort.
I think that's great advice and great ways to think outside of the box to help the business and add more value as an in-house lawyer and a member of the in-house department. So let's round out the conversation. The fourth and last installment of your series, principle number 4, which I just saw, I think it just hit the Outside GC blog webpage yesterday, was to take more risk. Now, again, bit surprised by this as well, since most lawyers are perceived as being incredibly risk-averse people who are simply avoiding risk to avoid larger problems down the road. So how does an in-house lawyer take more risk?
Yeah, this one, of course, is probably the most controversial of them all, but as with anything else, it's all about balancing. And unfortunately, the world in which we live in. It's a litigious world. You live in that world. You see it.
Of course.
And we're all familiar with the old, McDonald's hot coffee case, right? And person who bought coffee, they spilled it on them, they burned themselves because it was hot, ended up in litigation. And now we have cups that say, please be careful, the beverage you're about to enjoy is extremely hot, right? It's printed on all cups now because that's what's required. And so there are extreme examples in our society of litigation. And so it's led to this concept of I've got to protect my client against every conceivable possible risk. And the reality is we all as lawyers and even as business folks have to be more pragmatic and understand what we're trying to achieve. And yes, we have to mitigate what I call the real risks, the likely risks, the risks that could land folks in trouble and could impede the business. But at the same token, we need to be willing to explore the idea that we can take risks in other situations because either the risk is small or because we understand there are other ways to mitigate that risk rather than just from a legal perspective. So an example would be, let's say data breaches. Data protection these days, data privacy is paramount. And one of the, I'd say, most critical issues that many in-house legal and business folks are grappling with these days. Well, let's say you have a situation. And so whenever we negotiate this, it's always very contentious, I find, in most contracts. And lawyers want to litigate and negotiate this to the nth degree and close off every possibility, depending on which side of the seat you're sitting on. Either they want unlimited liability, they want you to be fully responsible if there's a data breach, or if you're on the other side, you want to, narrow that down as much as possible. Well, let's say we're in a situation where, I have a lawyer coming to me and we don't agree to unlimited liability in most cases, but the lawyer on their side is advocating aggressively for, hey, if there's a data breach, you have to have unlimited liability. You have to protect our client. And my first response may be no. Oh, well, there's that word, right? So let's go back to principle number 1, understanding the business. So I ask myself, and maybe meet with the internal business folks, is there an operational way that we can really mitigate this risk so that from a contractual perspective, I can maybe agree to something a little bit more balanced, maybe something that beyond my normal risk tolerance, but because on the operational side, I know the team can protect against us, can fix that. And so I actually had one example recently where it's an integration of a platform that processes, there's personal data involved, but the technology is such that the implementation of that process can be done in a way where we would never take actual custody and control of the data. We could keep it in the customer's environment. We could keep it fully protected. So we're at very, very little risk. So in that case, I can go back then to the lawyer and I can be like, well, maybe I can agree to unlimited liability, or I could cap consequential damages or other things, or I could do a super cap of something that's much higher than I ordinarily would agree to, because I understand that from a business perspective, we've been able to solve an issue to help mitigate the real risk. And so the real risk really isn't that big. So I can agree to more. I can take more risk in the contract, and that's okay. So it's not about just taking random risk like, okay, put the business at risk. No, it's about creating that balance, but you have to understand what the real risk to the business is and not just litigate it and negotiate it because of the potential theoretical risk that you're going to get burnt by the coffee.
I'll tell you what, I mean, that fantastic example that really sheds light on how you can implement these principles into real world, everyday situations. Very, very fascinating. Well, Jason, I've really enjoyed our conversation, but unfortunately, that's all the time that we have here today. It was a pleasure having you as my guest, and I really want to thank you for all of your time and the valuable insights that you shared with our audience. There were some just great ways for in-house lawyers to think outside of the box and start operating in a slightly different way to add tremendous value to their organizations. Now, if anyone would like to contact you, and I hope that you have a large volume of readership for your article series, but if anybody would like to contact you to read your articles or discuss any of the topics that we've covered here today, what would be the best way they can reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. You can just certainly send an email to me directly at Jason Karp, it's JASONKARP at OutsideGC.com. And you can certainly go to our website, OutsideGC.com, where I, as well as all of our attorneys, are listed, and reach out that way as well.
Jason, thank you so much. And of course, as always, I'd like to thank the audience for listening. If you'd like to hear more, please be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. And if you'd like to listen to a recording of today's program or like to learn about any litigation insurance or funding solutions that Certum Group provides to businesses to help them bring certainty to the uncertain world of litigation and also to help turn in-house legal departments from cost centers into profit centers, please visit our website at www.certumgroup.com. And as always, I can be reached directly at kevin.s@certumgroup.com. Thanks again, Jason, and until next time.
Thanks, Kevin.